Welcome. Thank you, David. You guys can hear me okay? And the screen share is working. Yes. Okay, cool. All right. Well, thanks for coming, everyone. I'm really excited. I really can't even tell you how much I love having this opportunity, about every 4 weeks, to just uh, put my stuff out there. It's just a real honor. I'm trying to get my Zoom set up here. Okay. Um, yeah, so and this will be a short series. Um, it's kind of it's a short series in a sequence of a longer series. Um, I've been talking about emotional sobriety, and that's what we're still talking about. I've called this a case for coming down, recovering soul in the program of recovery. And today, the specifically the title is Powers Greater Than Ourself. And yeah, so and like I said, I'm really excited about this information specifically. When I started to figure this stuff out, a lot of things really started making sense, especially within the context of emotional sobriety. So, what I want to do real quick is I need to just kind of review what we've talked about the last two sessions. Just and I'll be as brief as I can, but this stuff really does play in. It all sort of builds on itself as we go along here. So we talked about spirit versus soul, and what we have with so I use these two words not in a metaphysical sense, right? I'm using them in more of a psychological sense, maybe more like psychological orientations, I think is a great way to understand it. Spirit is the orientation of the psyche that sort of goes upward. It moves toward clarity. It's lifted. It's all about unity, serenity, peace, awakening. These kinds of adjectives or metaphors are spiritual, right? Soul, on the other hand, is it pulls us downward. It pulls us towards what's ambiguous. It deals with depression, resentment. It's the soul feels tangled. It feels reflective. And once it's interesting to hold these two psychological orientations in mind. James Hillman was the person who first really began to kind of um, parse these two things out for us. And this is what he says just briefly: spirit is clarity and height, soul is complexity and depth. And so here's a perfect example to try to understand the difference, like in practical terms, between the spirit and the soul. So when I sit down to meditate, I may or may not get into a groove, right? And sometimes I get into that groove and I really feel it. And I feel that really strong connection. And I feel myself being lifted, and I'm just like, yes, like this aha moment, right? I've figured out the unifying equation of the psyche or something. And just as this is happening, then I suddenly a strange image crosses my mind, like a pink elephant or whatever, and I'm suddenly pulled back down to reality, right? That pulling down is the soul, and it's constantly pulling down on the spirit the way gravity pulls down on us. Okay, so that was the thing. The first session we spent about an hour talking about that. The next thing we talked about was the feeling function. And all of this ties into emotional sobriety, because I'm making the case that to cultivate emotional sobriety is to develop the feeling function the way Jung defined feeling. And Jung defined feeling as a psychological function of valuation, right? So feeling in this regard is not just being emotional. It's not feeling our feelings, right? Feeling is the function in our psyche that evaluates things, that evaluates life. Hillman called feeling the reason of the heart, and that's in contrast to the thinking function, which is the reason of the mind. So in regards to this valuating, aspect, von Franz, who was a student of Jung, said that the feeling function is the function of valuation. It tells us what a thing is worth to us, what its meaning is for us. So thinking then tells me what a thing is, and then the way I feel about that thing tells me what it's worth. So feeling tells me what things are worth. And without feeling, life tends to collapse into abstractions, rules, slogans, principles. Another way of saying this is that without feeling, the function of spirit takes over. Thinking dominates, and then we lose access to the reason of the heart, to the feeling function. Okay, so feeling also deals with the personal value system. It's what orients us to situations and to people based on a value system, right? And when we don't have our own value system developed, then we tend to migrate to other value systems, other collective value systems, like the 12 steps or the home group or the family or the culture, the politic, whatever it is, right? And so without our own functioning feeling, then we don't have our own value system with which to sort of root ourselves to life. And we tend to float away with the spirit. James Hillman, he equates feeling with soul, right? So we go back to soul work, to spirit and soul. Hillman says, the soul is only concerned with value. It does not ask for progress, mastery, or clarity, but for meaning. So again, the soul has no problem interrupting me when I'm in the middle of the greatest meditation of my life, because it's not really concerned with me having more clarity or mastery over anything. The soul demands that I relate to life through value, and that I'm searching for meaning, right? And so what we have then is sort of a train of thought. We go from Carl Jung, who says that feeling is the function of valuation. Then we move to von Franz. She builds on this a little bit. And then we move to Hillman. So there's sort of a string of thought here. And again, I want to express here that the research that I've done, really leaning on these depth psychologists, is that to cultivate emotional sobriety is to develop the feeling function. Like those two things are essentially synonymous, and which says a lot about Bill Wilson. I'll talk about that a little bit later. So there's what we're moving then towards is an archetypal typology. So Jung introduced the four functions: thinking, sensation, intuition, and feeling. And von Franz then emphasizes that she says, when feeling is the inferior function, it appears primitive, childish, or completely out of proportion. Now, and then Hillman builds on this, and this is the last review slide here. We're going to get into some history next. Hillman says soul enters through symptoms, complaints, and anxieties, through the out of proportion, the absurd, the excessive. What seems primitive or childish may be the psyche insisting upon itself. So this out of proportion thing is really important, because that's the soul, right? The soul is interrupting our lives through symptoms, complaints, anxieties, things that come out of proportion. If I fall in love with the wrong person at the wrong time in the wrong organization and I'm powerless over it, that's the soul. The soul is demanding that happens. In a big way, what we're actually powerless over is the soul. So if we talk about step one, we become powerless over alcohol. You could really make the case that the thing that's interfering with alcoholism or causing us to be alcoholic is the soul, because it's demanding that we look at it, that we progress, and that we not progress in this way of moving up, right? But that we progress in terms of finding our own value system and our own meaning. So what I'm talking about today then, and we talked about this last week, and those audios are available online. But if to develop the feeling function is emotional sobriety, then, and what I'm saying is that the culture, like generally in the Western civilization, we all suffer from an inferior feeling function. In other words, we don't have a functioning value system. We don't have a feeling function that's allowing us to relate through the reason of the heart. And And so when Wilson says that we need to, that emotional sobriety is a worthy goal, he's really pointing to something that goes beyond just 12 steps, right? Physical sobriety, yes, that's sort of, that's for us who suffer from alcoholism, right? But if we understand emotional sobriety as the development of the feeling function, then we can see that that his call to emotional sobriety is really culture wide, right? And so then the question is, what I want to explore today is how does the feeling function become the inferior function of an entire civilization, right? That's the question. Why is it that none of us have a developed feeling function? That's what I want to get into today. And the story, as we trace this story, it really, we get back to Socrates, 470 to 399 BC. Socrates Socrates marks a pivot in the culture, in Western culture in general. He's kind of known as the first modern man. He may be the first man who had an inferior feeling function, right? He was a great thinker. He was a philosopher. He was accused of something that the Greeks called Eusebia, which was irreverence for the gods. So, and I just earmark that, Eusebia, because later we're going to talk about something called Eusebia, which means reverence for the gods. So Socrates said that he was guided by his own inner daimones, right? So he was sort of rebelling against the community gods and was saying, no, I have my own gods. Thank you very much. I don't need your gods. And they didn't like that. They figured he was corrupting the youth. A daimon, by the way, is defined as a guiding spirit or demon. It's an intermediary between human and divine. A daimon is an inner voice. It shapes our destiny, our calling, and it brings forth symptoms. And a daimon is both benign and malign, right? It's neither good nor evil. So the way we think about a demon today, or even like a spirit, maybe just purely evil. But back then, in this culture, that there wasn't really words for good or evil. It was much more sophisticated, right? Things could be both good and bad at the same time, and they were able to sort of live in that ambiguous space because they still had a functioning feeling component in the psyche. So the thing about Socrates is he moves away from this old way, and he's a philosopher, and he pivots. So, and we could say that his pivot was from mythos, a mythical view of the world, to one that's called logos, right? Or a logical view of the world. Logos means rationale or logic in Latin. So logos, and it's a word that comes up in the New Testament, actually. So Socrates distrusted tragedy and poetry. And in his, as he sort of postulated about a perfect community called the Republic, he actually banned poets and tragedians from the Republic. This is what Plato wrote about Socrates, who Plato is his student, by the way. Socrates is speaking. He says, we must put an end to poetry of this kind. It is an imitation that has a harmful effect on the mind of the hearer. It feeds and waters the passions instead of drying them up. And so, so basically the reason Socrates and Plato are so pivotal in Western consciousness, in Western psychology, in Western history, is because they really mark the beginning of this shift away from an ancient perspective to a new perspective, the modern perspective, which is hyper fixated on reason. So, and there's a quick story here that I want to tell you. So Socrates' wife was named Xanthippe, and he's been condemned, and this is the famous prison scene. So he's in prison and he's about to be executed by drinking the hemlock poison in the cup. And his wife comes, Xanthippe, with their child, and she's really sad and she's really distraught that this is the end. Socrates is about to die. And he, without showing any emotion whatsoever, he turns to the people with him and says, get her out of here. She's disturbing my serenity. And so they take her away, And then he postulates for a few more minutes, and then he drinks the hemlock and dies. What he establishes here is this idea that was later to be called apatheia, which means to be without passion, right? Pathos, without passion. So this is the birth of apatheia, right? So it's this philosophical ideal that essentially means that the goal in life is to philosophize and to think well enough and to move away from the realm of passion and feeling and emotion. And this is still alive today. So this is the modern way, right? So we practice this in the 12 steps without even knowing it, right? We say, don't let your feelings get the best of you. We say feelings aren't facts. Nobody cares how you feel. These are Socratic ideals that have carried through, right? That have now become sort of culture wide. Whereas when he was preaching this stuff, he was sort of a really free thinker. So what happens is then, so Socrates sets in motion this train of thought, right? He's and the event with Xanthippe getting kicked out becomes sort of symbolic. That kind of becomes the creation myth of modern Western culture. Over time, this symbolic gesture becomes really, really kind of entrenched, right? And apatheia becomes the way of the philosophers, and then it becomes the way of the theologians. Okay, so as we move from ancient Greece, we move into Rome, and we get into like Marcus Aurelius and St. Augustine and stuff. These guys were all really big on the idea of apatheia. And what they do is they eventually write it into Christian scripture, right? So this new thinking, this new way of being without passion, of not feeling one's emotions, and of literally considering the feminine sort of crazy and hysterical, gets pushed aside for this new ideal, which is moving towards apatheia. So St. Augustine, and by the way, too, what emerges from this is really the basis of this talk, which is monotheism, right? Monotheism is to believe in just one God. That this one God is the sole creator and the sustainer of the universe. And it's the reason we move towards monotheism is because the feminine is complex. It's emotional. It's confusing. It can't be really pinned down, right? So over time, what happens is the divine feminine is essentially erased, right? And we end up with this purely masculine Godhead. So the Godhead becomes a boys' club, just like theology did, and just like philosophy did, right? And later, just like psychology would, and finally, just like spirituality did, even in the 12 steps. And I'm going to talk about this next week, right? That because there's really two faces of this apatheia. The one is towards monotheism. The other one is toward a rejection of feeling. So the feeling function gets really diminished and destroyed. St. Augustine says, and this is eternal life. So by 350 to 430, this is the doctrine now. This is eternal life, that they may know thee, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom thou hast sent. So the polytheism of ancient times is gone. Now we're in Rome, and we're practicing like a pure monotheism. And then this is actually one of my favorite biblical scriptures, but it's John chapter 1, verse 1 through 3. It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. Now, this is really subtle here, but basically by the time this specific scripture is written and it becomes canon, that you can see that the feminine has been completely wiped out of the canon, right? There is no divine feminine. Where there was Sophia, the goddess of wisdom, she's now gone. And to the point where they're saying that the man, the word, right, that logos, the word is logos, it's the masculine word, that was the only thing in the beginning. And so basically what's happened is the feminine is completely wiped away to where it becomes even a sin to be a woman, okay? And keep in mind, as I go through this all has an effect of essentially erasing the feeling function. So when we talk about generating emotional sobriety in the modern era, the problem is much more than just this simple thing of like learning how to feel our feelings, right? We're literally up against this whole system that's been built that was really kind of this Socratic ideal, right? Which is apatheia. So apatheia then is the modern wound. James Hillman says that our complexities are history at work in the soul. And so what happens is as these theological systems and then spirituality later grows, our fixation with serenity, with not having resentment, with not feeling anger, right? These things become these sort of ideals, right? And it's this really monotheistic ideal that we're moving towards. And we can trace, and so at the root of this really is this the problem between spirit and soul, right? What's happened is that that spirit, that psychological orientation called spirit has been elevated, even exalted, and the soul has been diminished and essentially erased. And that's the culture we live in today. This is what James Hillman says. So much is feeling the problem of the times that one could preposterously assert that the whole field of psychotherapy resulted from inadequacies of the feeling function. Our personal feeling problems are partly a collective result of the ages of repression. That's what I've just gone through, the ages of repression, right? Starting with Socrates, moving up through the Romans and basically, to the modern days. Our feeling problems are collective problems, and to deal with them only directly with a new doctrine of feeling and a revolution in its name is not enough. And so he's offering his own criticism actually of psychotherapy and psychiatry, right? That psychotherapy's fixation on only focusing on the feeling function or on feeling itself, just emotion, pure emotion, it actually isn't enough to fix the problem, mainly because it's not dealing with the underlying problem of soul, right? If we don't recover the soul, then we can't do much to regenerate the feeling function. Feeling is more than just feeling one's emotions. It has to do with the value system. And the way we tap into that value system is through soul work, which is surprisingly what we're doing here. This is soul work. So what I want to say is this then. Mr. Hyde, whom, Wilson kind of gave us Mr. Hyde. So Mr. Hyde is not just a personal complex, right? Mr. Hyde is a historical sort of civilizational complex, right? So, and that because our complexities are our work, our history at work in the soul. And that history goes very, very deep, right? It's really it's kind of at the foundation of Western psychology is this idea of apatheia. It runs so deep that we don't even think to question it. And it's pretty interesting. I just want to say this real quick. Like I've recently in some meetings, I've had the experience of like trying to talk about feelings and like just in AA and just trying to be more honest about like, just how I'm feeling, right? And it's really funny, but the response that comes like from some of the old timers, so I see why Wilson has this criticism, it's still valid today. They just get very upset and they say things like, that is not AA. Like we don't talk about our feelings here. We don't feel our feelings here. We don't care how you feel. Like go somewhere else, right? And when really like the 12 steps, like, step 4, step 5, step 1, they're based on feelings. It's all about me examining my feelings and being honest about how I'm feeling and writing the stuff down and writing down the causes and conditions. In a couple of sessions, we'll go through the 4th step with this perspective. But again, the reason I'm laying all this foundation, all this groundwork is because just so that we understand more clearly what we're up against. So over the centuries, then spirit dominates, soul is subjugated until we finally arrive at Carl Jung. And by the time Jung comes around, the West has an entirely new metaphysics. In other words, like this brand new sort of approach to the world, right? The world has shifted from a polytheistic framework where there's many gods with many roles and many daimones to this more monotheistic framework, right? Which is like, there's just one God and it's one way, and there's one feeling that's okay, and that's serenity, right? So Jung is born into this same framework. He works with Freud. Freud had discovered the unconscious by working with hysterical women. Next session, we're going to talk about hysteria in the Big Book. It's a fascinating discussion, especially in the context of emotional sobriety. But Jung works with Freud, and Jung was also working with schizophrenics, and then he had his own sort of major dream life. And so Jung is credited for rediscovering the soul, right? So Freud sort of saw the unconscious as a reservoir of repressed sort of drives and instincts that needed to be kind of disciplined, right? That you could work on it. Jung kind of shifts this, and he understands the unconscious is alive with images, symbols, and with myths, and that it's not something that's broken, right? He sees it as this symbolic ground of our lives, and he understands that the psyche is images. This is what Jung says. The psyche is the greatest of all cosmic wonders, the sine qua non of the world as an object. It is the only entity of which we have immediate knowledge. All else is mediated by it. We live immediately in a world of images. So Jung basically says that the psyche itself, and he calls it the soul, is a medium that we live in. His phrase was to be in soul, esse in anima. And so he's, and what he understands about the soul is that it speaks to us through images and through symbols, right? And that's a big deal, because basically everything we process in our mind we do so through imagery. And so the soul then becomes like this major function, right? It's the only thing we have immediate knowledge of, right? It's almost like the Descartes thing, like I think, therefore I am. But what Jung is saying is that the only thing that we know immediately is the soul. Everything else is filtered through this perspective. So we've gone from the devastation of the feeling function and the loss of the soul through the centuries, 2,500 years. We get back to Jung, and the reason Jung is so important is because he rediscovers the soul and reintroduces the soul to the world. Now we get to Bill Wilson and James Hillman, these parallel pioneers. And this is the reason why I talk about these guys so much. So we're familiar with Jung's influence on the spiritual program of Alcoholics Anonymous, right? Keep in mind the word spiritual. Jung was very familiar with spirit. I wrote about this in the book, Shadow of a Figure of Light. What we're looking at now is Jung's contribution to emotional sobriety. Uh-oh, the dogs might bark. So in this conversation, we transition towards Hillman. Jung rediscovers the psyche, and he understands function, the feeling as a function evaluation. James Hillman comes along, so Hillman went to Zurich in 1953. He was an American. He went to the University of Dublin or something. Or I can't remember the name of it. I might be getting it wrong. But then he went to Zurich after that, and he studied with Jung for a few years before Jung died, and then he stayed on as a Jungian. And he sort of sharpens what Jung began, and he really discovers the distinction between spirit and soul. And this is again, soul interrupts spirit's flight with the gravity of our psychic depths. So this is sort of James Hillman's big kind of contribution. Hillman insists that the soul speaks through feeling, and that was a big deal, because if we're always trying to disregard our feelings or move past our feelings or bypass our feelings with spiritual tools, then we're missing the meaning that could otherwise come. And what Hillman suggested is that we practice psychotherapy with spirituality, right? That spirit and soul need to come back together. And the way we do that is by feeling our feelings and understanding the feeling function and looking for value. Now we go to Bill Wilson, co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, 2 decades sober. He's written the Big Book, the 12 Steps, the 12 Traditions, but he confesses that he's plagued by catastrophic depression, and he calls this Mr. Hyde. And he coins the phrase emotional sobriety in the 1958 Grapevine letter. Recognizing, and this is what's I think, easy to miss in that. But he basically says spiritual practice alone is not enough to deal with the inner turmoil and conflict. He asks the question, why won't the 12 steps treat depression? Right. And here we know why, thanks to James Hillman, because we have because depression is the soul pulling down and the 12 steps are spirit moving up. And so anything that's serving to awaken the spirit is not going to do much to treat symptoms of the soul. Wilson says that Hyde represents a split off emotional body that was immune to step work, right? And this is what Wilson's phrase in the essay. He says how to translate a right mental conviction into a right emotional result. Well, that's not only the neurotics problem, it's the problem of life itself for all of us who have got to the point of real willingness to practice AA's principles in all our affairs. So, and I love what he says here, right? If you really get to the point in the 12th step where you're like, I really need this to work in all my affairs, no pun intended, right? For Wilson and for myself, then what do we do, right? Where do we go next? Well, this is what Wilson says. It's the next frontier, emotional sobriety. This is why Wilson and Hillman belong side by side. Hillman was doing this in the 60s and 70s, Wilson in the 50s and 60s. They're speaking to different groups of people. They're speaking in different languages almost, but they're naming the same truth. Hillman is speaking from the side of psychology, right? And he's saying that the soul refuses to bypass what the spirit wants to bypass, and he insists that we descend. Wilson is speaking from the side of spirituality, right? Like pure, unadulterated spirituality. There's no doubt about it. Wilson was a spiritual giant. He's saying the spiritual awakening is not enough, right? There's still this emotional underworld that goes untouched. Why doesn't spirit fix it? So they're both realizing that healing requires more than ascent, right? Hillman's critique of psychotherapy was that it's another spiritual practice that's trying to ascend over the emotions, over the emotional body. So we have to engage with these unruly forces inside to do this work. So with that, then we've kind of laid the groundwork with spirit and soul, with the feeling function, with this brief history. We kind of, what this allows us to understand then is this Western container that we sort of inhabit, right? This is what I call our metaphysics, okay? Metaphysics means beyond the physical. And to me, the metaphysics is something that it's these very deep assumptions that we have about the world that are so structural to the way we view things, right, in our Western psychology that we don't even think to question them. That's what a metaphysics is. And so for 2,500 years, Western thought has moved away from spirit or away from soul towards spirit, towards clarity, towards logos. And this is the metaphysics that we all basically swim around in and don't even know it. And the thing, and what I'm talking about today, so there's really two branches of this metaphysics that I want to cover that I think are really central to the conversation around emotional sobriety from a depth psychology perspective. The first one is this monotheistic framework, right? That if we're moving towards clarity, then we have to get rid of all the gods, right? There can only be one God, one solution, one clarifying equation, right? And then the other one is that as we move towards monotheism, we automatically move away from femininity. And because the feminine represents everything that spirit doesn't like, right? Because spirit is all about unity. Femininity is all about complexity and emotion and depth, okay? So we're talking about metaphysics today then, or monotheism, right? So this feels so natural, we don't even think to question it. And when we speak of our underlying causes and conditions, especially in terms of emotional sobriety, it's very useful if we can have this framework in mind. It's helped me tremendously. That's why I'm trying to share it. So if we look at, we talk about this monotheistic metaphysics, right? I want to redefine monotheism in a way that really kind of helps things to kind of settle in. So when we look at it from a psychological perspective, this is monotheism. Whenever singularity is equated with truth and plurality is equated with confusion, right? So monotheism is always moving towards singularity. So, and that's the movement of spirit, right? So spirit and monotheism are essentially the same. Spirit is the masculine aspect of the psyche. It moves towards monotheism. This is why the Godhead is an all male Godhead, right? This whole psychological movement makes sense. Examples of monotheistic bias are these. 1, feelings aren't facts. 2, so even a fixation with facts, right? That's monotheistic. To say just let it go, that's also monotheistic. It's a movement towards singularity and away from plurality. Another monotheistic idea is that forgiveness is freedom from resentment, right? Or that freedom from resentment is the #1 goal. That's also monotheistic. To say that acceptance is the answer to all of our problems, that's also monotheistic. So detachment is the end of suffering, right? That idea, also monotheistic, right? Even though it's an Eastern ideal, it's got a Western spin to it, right? We brought over the Eastern ideal, but we didn't bring over the pantheon of Eastern religion with it, and all of the confusing feelings and emotions that go along with it. So monotheism tries to warp complexity into a single point of wholeness, right? So Jung's archetype of wholeness is also a monotheistic idea. And so Henry Corbin, this is what he says about monotheism. He says, monotheism elevates an idol just at the point where it denounces such. Doing so from within a polytheism, it poorly understands. So this is what Corbin means by this. Monotheism presents itself as a rejection of idols, right? If there's only one God, there can be no other gods. So those are the idols, right? But as soon as we abolish the other gods, we enthrone our own idol, right? The one God becomes conceived as singular, obviously becomes an idol. But so monotheism creates the very idolatry that it denounces, precisely because it collapses divine plurality into a rigid singularity. So the most obvious example of Corbin's statement in the fellowships is when we insist on the big book as being right no matter what it says, right? The book becomes an idol, right? If we're unable to examine some of the statements in the book with maturity, then we're practicing this sort of monotheistic perspective. So any kind of dogmatic thinking is going to be monotheistic, right? It's dogmatic thinking is always an attempt at a spiritual bypass. So all of these things are connected, right? And the reason we use dogmatic thinking is because we don't have our own value system. That means we don't have a feeling function that's online, right? If I don't have my own internal value system, then I can't really decide what's right and wrong. So I wait and I let you or the fellowship or whoever tell me what's right or wrong. And that fellowship will almost always move us towards a monotheistic attitude. So yeah. Now here's why this is an issue, right? The psyche itself is inherently polytheistic, right? So if our spiritual practice is moving us towards monotheism, it's not taking into account the fact that the soul itself is polytheistic. So not just our feelings are polytheistic, basically everything that takes place in the psyche is polytheistic. I have many voices in my head, right? I have many desires, many ideas of what's right and wrong, many different relationships with the same person, right? One minute I hate somebody, the next minute I love them. It's very polytheistic and really amorphous, right? Um, and this was Jung's discovery, right? He doesn't just discover the soul, but he discovers a soul full of archetypes and inner figures and daimones. Each of them is autonomous, right? With its own will and voice. He calls them autonomous psychic complexes. Jung said that all ages have believed in the gods in one form or another. Only an unparalleled impoverishment of symbols could enable us to rediscover the gods as a psychic factor. So in other words, and this was a point I made in Shadow of a Figure of Light, right? That the way we view the God image is indicative of our relationship to our inner life, right? The gods are psychic factors. So Jung said that the gods have returned as diseases, right? That Zeus now inhabits the solar plexus, and that rather than go to the priest or whoever, now we go to the doctor to fix us, right? Who's basically practicing witchcraft just the same. But these autonomous psychic complexes are polytheistic, right? And this is what Hillman says: the gods are dead. Sorry, I messed this up. It should say God is dead, but not the gods. God is dead, but not the gods. And so if we go back to the point I made in Shadow, right, that the God image is indicative of our relationship to our inner life. And that the gods are these psychological realities, right, that we project our inner states onto our conceptions of God. The question I asked in Shadow of a Figure of Light was basically, is my God image, is my conception of God big enough to allow for the God itself to have a shadow, right? And the point that I was trying to make is that if I don't allow my God image to have a shadow, then I may be unable to see my own shadow in my own life, right? That's kind of the question. And I think it's a valid question. The question, so what I'm exploring here then is to say, is my conception big enough to account for the polytheistic nature of the psyche, right? So we're sort of, see, because even my book Shadow of a Figure of Light is very monotheistic, right? It's because it's about shadow versus light, that black and white thinking, right? And it's trying to sort of blend the black and white thinking, but it's still very monotheistic by nature. Bill also understood the psyche as polytheistic. And we know this because just in many phrases in the big book, right? We talk about the alcoholic mind, the self, the four horsemen. He was no stranger to the many voices in the head, right? But then in 1958, in the Grapevine article, he admits that he had found himself still lacking real maturity and balance. Again, he's 2 decades sober, created AA and just a spiritual giant, but he's still restless, he's still depressed, and he's still wondering why the steps won't fix it. This is what Bill says, and this is great. It's subtle, but it's really great. He says, how to bring the unconscious life into line with what we really believe, what we really feel, what we actually know, right? He's really contemplating here the value system. And like, how do I align my value system with the unconscious, with Mr. Hyde, with this split off destructive aspect of myself, the part of me that I can't tame with prayer, amends, service, slogans, meeting makers, right? What do we do about that part, right? But the thing is, Hyde is not just personal, it's historical. Mr. Hyde is archetypal, and it's part of the polytheistic psyche that rebels against everything we want to be monotheistic. We want to package our problems and our emotional issues into nice little boxes and then set them aside, and just bypass right over them on our way to perfect serenity. I just want to read this to kind of bring this home. This is subtle but clear. When Bill writes about trying to bring the unconscious life into line with what we really believe and feel, he's describing exactly what Jung and Hillman called the polytheistic psyche. Bill understands the psyche isn't one thing that can be brought neatly under conviction. It is many daimones, each with its own will and claim on us. What Bill calls Mr. Hyde is just one of those figures standing in opposition to the other parts of himself, what he knows, believes, feels, etc. Emotional sobriety then isn't about forcing those voices into one harmony, which what he refers to as absolute dependency, absolute freedom, absolute truth, but learning to live among them and to value each of them singularly without being possessed by any single one. That's what Bill says basically in his own words, right? So Bill also recognizes the polytheistic nature of the psyche. But here's where the problem comes in. This monotheistic bias is a really, really hard one to shake. So is the misogynistic bias that we'll talk about next week. Jung's gift is that he shatters the illusion that the psyche is simple or that it's unified. He gives us the archetypes, the polytheistic psyche, the voices of God inside his disease, right? He understands this chorus that's taking place in the psyche. But the metaphysics runs deep indeed, for Jung himself fell victim to the monotheistic fallacy in his own theology, right? And this was Hillman's great critique of Carl Jung. Hillman was a post-Jungian, and this is why. He says, by elevating the self as the God image within, Jung carried forward the monotheistic tradition into psychology. The psyche was again imagined in terms of unity and hierarchy rather than its many-sided polytheistic reality. So this is what I talk about in Shadow of a Figure of Light a lot. It's that the self essentially is the higher power, right? And that the self is this sort of unifying equation. And it's interesting that this is really, I think this is kind of the issue or the problem, right? Is when we're trying to establish emotional sobriety. It's sort of what Wilson alludes to, right? There's an implication that our pathology is polytheistic, but our psychology or our theology or our medicine is monotheistic, right? And the problem then that we have is this hierarchy, okay? Because if what is good is unified up above and everything else is sort of below and must be brought into line with that, then there becomes an issue, especially when the monotheism is so masculine by nature. Then we tend to essentially disregard everything that's feminine. And now that we equate femininity with emotionality, that becomes a real problem when we try to establish emotional sobriety, because we're disregarding our own femininity. That's really the nature of misogyny. So when we look at our own theology, step 2, with this clear comprehension of the kind of historical background, we ask, what does step 2 mean within the context of this Western container? It says we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. So I want to be super clear. On the surface, step 2 is plenty, obviously followed up by the other work, but it's plenty to get us sober, right? If alcoholism is a problem of spirit, right, which it is, then a spiritual program will solve alcoholism. It is a sufficient replacement. But as Jung said, and as Wilson found out, the serious problems in life are never fully solved. And so while step 2, this monotheistic structure will allow us to overcome alcoholism and addiction and possibly some other sort of glaring character defects, it doesn't do much to touch on our emotional life, on our relationship problems, right? Step 2 carries in our theology, in the 12 steps in general. I call it a theology because I think that's what it is. It carries with it this whole weight of Western metaphysics, and it's really saturated with this monotheistic bias, the same thing that Jung's own system suffered from. It's interesting. Hillman worked with Jung, was at Jung's place, and became one of the directors of one of the programs at the Jungian Institute. And he called it like a priesthood, right? He said that there's sort of a priesthood that's taking place in Jung's own house, right? And I think we can see the same priesthood in different 12-step spaces, right? Like the circuit speaker thing is kind of priesthoody, right? Like it's got that vibe to it. So AA theology shows this bias in a lot of different ways. Number one, resentment is the number one offender. That's a big one, right? We must be free of anger. Feelings aren't facts. These repetitive slogans tend to repeat this monotheistic bias that always moves toward a bypass. It's always an emotional or a spiritual bypass. So in the 12 steps, and this is really interesting here. So, and this is how subtle this problem can be with this monotheism. Even though we get to choose our own higher power in the 12 steps, right? God as we understood him, uh, that we default to the monotheistic bias so quickly that like we just like, and I realized this about myself, like my own conceptions of God, whether they were, you know, the self, right? The Jung's conception, or, you know, the universe, the energy, all of that it's monotheistic. Even Wilson's statement that God is everything or else he is nothing is a statement of monotheism. It's, you know, because if God is everything, then God is one, right? So, and and really, I just want to, this isn't like this is an interesting critique, right? And I think it's a critique for all of us, but it's like, the question is so if I start to look at this differently, what is it going to mean for me, right? Like if I'm able to, I've found that as my conception of God grows, I grow, right? And so if I'm able to kind of be open-minded to these ideas that really we owe it to James Hillman for introducing, then I think I can move towards a more sort of emotionally sober frame of mind. And I think this too, this goes to show why, and I love what Jim Worley says, that emotional sobriety is the fourth legacy. There's so much symbolism in that statement, just in terms of Jung's own his own sort of conception, right? But it's the fourth legacy because it's something, it's beyond, right? That it's that it really is the next frontier. It's the image of the soul, right? And the monotheistic bias is moving away from the soul all the time, right? So, and that it's literally built to reject the soul. It grows out of Socrates' apatheia. So with that, I'm going to move into some solution for a few minutes. So this brings us to this concept called Eusebia, which was right reverence. So around the time of Socrates, the Greeks were polytheistic. They practiced engaging with many gods, right? Not just worshiping one god. And the word they used for that was Eusebia. So Socrates was tried for Eusebia, right? And that was corrupting the youth. And so he kind of marks the beginning of this pivot towards the new metaphysics, towards monotheism, towards logos over mythos, towards reason over image, spirit over soul. After Socrates, religion itself begins shifting towards monotheism, toward law, creed, obedience, salvation, redemption, serenity. But before Socrates, the Greeks didn't even have a word for religion the way we do. Their word was Eusebia. And so this is sort of the pre-Socratic approach to religion. This word was Eusebia, like I said, it means right reverence. It doesn't mean belief. It doesn't mean obedience. And it wasn't meant to yoke somebody, right? Eusebia, more than anything, meant to practice propriety. And so what you would do is you would discern which God was present in which situation, and then you would decide, like you would think about, like you would really feel it, and you would make an offering or a fitting oblation as a sacrifice to this God. So then religious practice itself in this polytheistic world becomes a fluid, dynamic, evaluative interaction with the internal world, right? The gods as psychic factors. So you end up looking inside for answers. In this sense, then, Eusebia was a religious practice that involved accessing the feeling function. It was a religion based on feeling. They examined, you know, the other thing is the Greeks don't have a word for evil, okay? Because the gods have both good and bad characteristics. And so that adds even more nuance to the level of feeling that had to be practiced in order to really do this Eusebia, right? Because you had to be really clear which God it was that was speaking, and also what the God was trying to say. Was it his or her positive attributes or negative attributes? Like, what was this, right? So, and I find this very interesting if we look at this as the gods as psychic factors, right? So when I speak of this polytheism, I'm talking about the internal world in a mythological way, right? These symbols are representative of internal states. So I just want to make that really clear. This is very appropriate in terms of emotional sobriety. Xenophon, who was a Socrates contemporary, says Eusebia is not merely in sacrifices and rituals, but in honoring the gods with discernment. And so they really were trying to practice propriety and knowing which God was present. By the time we reach Rome, okay, so if you're, history, we have the Socrates is, 400 BC or something. Christianity starts to emerge around 300 AD in Rome. The Romans had a polytheistic system, sort of, but they started to really, they had already kind of become far more entrenched in thinking and logic. They were well known for their laws. Interestingly, there was 12 laws in Rome, right? Like kind of like we have 12 steps. I think that's kind of funny. But by the time we get to Rome, the word for religion now is called religio, and that's literally the word from which we get our word religion. And religio in Latin means binding obligation. It means to yoke, and it's devotion as duty, right? Not discernment. And this is this really subtle point here, that by the time we get to like really entrenched Christianity, there's no room for discernment in religious practice. There's nothing to discern, right? The religio itself tells us what to do, how to do it, when to do it, why to do it. We don't need to make any discerning decisions of our own. There's nothing to feel here. This becomes religious practice for a devastated feeling function for people who don't know how to feel and discern for themselves and find their own value system. So, and this is what Cicero says, 106 BCE. So he's getting closer, but he's a Roman. Religion is that which binds us to the gods in pious devotion. So already this practice of engaging with divinity has shifted towards pious devotion. So interestingly, addictio was also a legal term like religio. Addictio was a debtor who was surrendered into another's power. So a debtor, if like you declared bankruptcy, then they would just turn you over to your debtor, you would be bound by law to him or her or him as a slave. That was addictio, to be addicted. Obviously, this word later becomes our word for addiction. In Rome, both religion and addiction come to mean bondage. And I think this is fascinating. One of them means bondage to divine law. The other one is bondage to human compulsion. One is bondage to spirit, right, with a capital S, and the other one is bondage to spirits, as in alcoholic spirits. And I did some digging. I found this interesting little phrase, religio spiritus, addictio spiritum, utraque vinculum. It basically translates to bound to spirit, bound to spirits, both are chains. And because they both have this very interesting tie in terms of law, right? There's an obligation there. Now, we're going back to Eusebia. So this, as I said before, this is kind of an approach, a religion of feeling, a practice of feeling. I hesitated to call it a spiritual practice, right? Because it's not. It's not spiritual. It's soul work. And so we move towards a practice of feeling. So Eusebia is not religio in the sense of binding obligation. For the Greeks, their relationship to the divine was really psychological, right? It functioned through the discernment of feeling. So there wasn't obedience to one God, but they honored the many voices in the psyche. Each feeling was a presence, a daimon, a God asking for recognition. Whether it was benign or malign, it didn't matter. The daimon was the same, right? No daimon inner voice was better. It was for better or worse, not for right or wrong. And then they would carefully discern which God they would offer sacrifice to. And that brings me to this point about sacrifice, right? The word sacrifice, sacrificiere, or something like that in Latin, means to set apart, to consecrate, or to make sacred. So in this way, one of these, say it was resentment, right? The idea of sacrificing resentment to one of the gods was not annihilation. It was not resolution. It was not an idea of forgiveness, right? That would be a Roman religious attitude, right? This was an idea of setting it apart, right? Of making it sacred, right? So how interesting is it then if I do say I'm being torn up by a resentment, right? And rather than rushing to look for my part and then rushing to make amends to do anything just to make the feeling go away, what if my practice was the opposite, right? And I was like, oh, this is sacred. Whatever this is sacred, and I need to look into it. I need to essentially commune with it and ask it what it wants, right? That would be a practice of Eusebia. And you can see where this begins to really, the value system grows out of this, and so does emotional sobriety. And if emotional sobriety is the rediscovery of the feeling function, then this practice of Eusebia is a great way to do this, right? And this is a very polytheistic practice because it's not focused on any obedience to laws, to rules, to slogans, right? It's a process of slowly discerning and being in relationship to the inner life, which is the one thing that spirit does not want to have anything about or to do with, right? Spirit is all about going on to the mountaintop. This is something I wrote. Emotional sobriety is not another name for serenity, but for fidelity to one's feelings, one's daimones. It means staying present with the inner life rather than fleeing from it. And yeah, emotional sobriety is Eusebia of the polytheistic soul. So when these feelings become inner daimones, they become inner guides. So the Greeks had no word for good or evil, as I said. And so they had to distinguish, right? And I'm not suggesting we practice Greek religion, right? But what I'm suggesting is that we learn what the world looked like with a feeling function before Socrates came along and messed the whole thing up. What does it look like to approach everything that takes place on the inside as sacred? There's some good stuff to learn from the Greeks. So for example, resentment may have been a manifestation of Ares, the god of war, right? And then so I look at this from my own perspective. So if Ares, the god of war, the god of anger, is here and it's coming through this resentment, what is it showing me, right? And I think about some of the resentments that I have that linger. And I think they tell me that I have work to do, right? I think the soul is telling me it's not time to move on yet, right? That there's still more meaning and value to be mined from these feelings, right? That maybe perhaps even if I have made amends and I still feel this way, there's a reason for that. And rather than try to avoid it or like do something to make the feeling go away, it's like, no, to sit with it actually and to make it sacred. There's a lot of the like grief, Persephone. Persephone was taken to the underworld once per year. And while she was gone, winter would come and everything would die. But I think for me, grief, I feel a lot of grief, to be honest. If I'm being honest, like I grieve my childhood, I grieve my relationship with my parents. I grieve relationships with other people in AA who can't really meet me on an emotional level. These are sad things, right? And it doesn't mean I haven't forgiven, right? It just means that I'm aware that there's some sadness here. And then the question is like, so when I set this grief apart as being sacred, then um what what values am I mining from it, right? Um I'm mining what's important to me, what it means to be in an intimate relationship, right? How it is to interact with people and what I can expect, right? It sort of also kind of pings me about what's not safe in a relationship. Those are the kinds of things that come up when we practice Eusebia. Um, so we've traveled a long ways today. So we've gone from Greece to Rome to the modern West, right? And um, we've looked at the underlying causes and conditions uh, to our lack of feeling, right? Why emotional sobriety is so elusive and so difficult and so hard for us to grasp. And I think hopefully we can understand a little bit more why today, right? Because the Greeks practiced this idea of Eusebia, right? This polytheistic approach to the inner world. Um, in that system, feeling was central, right? The feeling function, right? The every relationship was subject to Eusebia. And so it would be, in the market, in the temple, wherever, within one's own inner world, right? This how do we relate to other things and other people with propriety? So then Socrates comes along, and he was kind of like the first red pill guy, he basically banishes poets from the Republic and dismisses his wife's grief as he's about to die. He models apatheia, reason over passion, right? And begins this pivot, and begin, uh, rationale becomes far more important and desirable than pathos and emotion and feeling. And this posture spreads through Stoicism, through Rome, through Christianity, through the Middle Ages, right up into the modern West, right up into the 12 steps, where unfortunately we practice apatheia without even knowing it, right? And emotional sobriety then involves waking up to this metaphysics and at least for now, questioning the monotheism that's just built into our psyche, right? And perhaps looking for a different way, stepping out of the black and white that is that, right? And like I said, next week or next month, next session, we're going to look at hysteria in the Big Book, which is another fascinating conversation along these lines. So I just want to touch on the Renaissance. There's an interesting parallel real quickly. Why the Renaissance was so great. They practiced humanism. There was an explosion of art and image. The Renaissance is basically from the 1300s to the 1600s. It started in Florence and then kind of spread across Europe. And we all know the Renaissance. We get Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Dante, Shakespeare, right? There's an explosion of art. There's an explosion of drama, poetry. Alchemy takes off. Again, music is super rich. There's like a psychological richness, right, with the Renaissance. And it was a big deal. And this is what James Hillman says. The Renaissance was so great because it went back to Greece, to the polytheistic imagination, and with it came a rebirth of the soul. And so it's very interesting to look at the rebirth of the Renaissance. Kind of, it creates this beautiful period of human history. And I guess what I'm suggesting is a Renaissance in our recovery, right? Just in our individual recovery, that we look for a rebirth of the soul. We can go back to the polytheistic imagination like the Greeks did. We can return, and it's a turn toward this polarity, the plurality in the psyche, right? This plurality, that we understand that, Mr. Hyde has many different masks and many different costumes. And that rather than only seeing our pathology as polytheistic, right, that we start to engage with those polytheistic, whatever they are, the daimones, and try to mind them, right? And engage and see what we can pull from them. And because I think emotional sobriety is really just about learning to weigh these daimones, not to silence them, not to try to bypass our feelings, right? Not to obey them blindly, but to honor them as voices of the soul and to try to cultivate our own value system out of engaging with them. It has been my experience that this happens. I'm a guy who had nothing to do with the feeling function, was very, very emotionally disconnected in my life, in all of my relationships. And when I started practicing this soul work and doing this stuff, it's actually completely changed the way, just the way I interact with the world. So, yes. So hopefully, I know I went about 10 minutes over. Thank you so much, everyone, for sticking around. And I hope you enjoyed it.